A courier bag went through the wrong scanner at a side entrance to Windsor Castle just after 8 in the morning, and the officer running the belt saw something on his screen he was not meant to see. A stack of place cards, cream, gold-edged and printed along the top of every one of them. 3 words the palace had banned in writing 36 hours earlier, under the authority of Her Majesty. 18 hours before that bag went through the scanner, Laura Lopes' office had received a signed instruction from the King's private secretary telling her, in one paragraph, that the phrase was not to appear on anything. Not the cards, not the program, not the menu, not the little folded note the florist tucks into the arrangement on the top table. The instruction was read at 2:14 in the afternoon. The read receipt logged. No reply came back. And the courier bag came through the gate the next morning anyway, addressed to a private secretary who had not ordered it and did not know it was coming. Princess Anne was told about the cards at 9:02. By 9:40, she had cancelled 2 engagements, moved a 3rd, and was in a car heading toward Windsor. And when the Princess Royal cancels a Wednesday morning to drive an hour across country, she is not doing it for a table setting. The guest list ran to 38 names. 36 of them belonged to people you would expect. 2 of them belonged to people who had no business being in a room at Windsor at all. And by the time Anne worked out who had put those 2 names on the list, one member of the Queen's household had already left the building through a side door and was not answering their phone. Quick word before we go on. I'm Harold. I go through the paperwork this family leaves behind. The household filings, the visitor logs, the diary entries, the small things that turn up in a footnote 6 months after everybody has stopped paying attention. What you're about to hear is me laying the pieces down in the order they landed. Stay with me to the end because those 2 extra names on the guest list are the reason a private lunch at Windsor stopped being a private lunch and turned into something Anne is still not talking about publicly. Back to the beginning, because the instruction is where this starts, and the instruction is the reason nobody in that building can pretend they did not know. It went out on Monday afternoon on headed paper from the King's private secretary. 1 page, 4 paragraphs. The language of a man who has written 1,000 of these and knows exactly how much room he is leaving. Mrs. Lopes's private lunch could proceed at Windsor on the date requested. The rooms on the ground floor of the south wing were available. Catering could be arranged through the usual household channels. And then the 4th paragraph, which was the whole point of the letter. No royal styling of any kind was to appear on printed material connected to the event. Not on cards, not on menus, not on the seating plan, not on the invitations that had already gone out. If any such material had already been printed, it was to be destroyed and reprinted before the event took place. The letter closed with the usual formula and asked for written confirmation by close of business Tuesday. Laura Lopes' office opened the letter at 2:14. The read receipt fired, and nothing came back. Now, hold that silence in your head for a moment, because silence inside this family is never nothing. Every household in that building runs on written confirmations. A letter arrives, somebody reads it, somebody types 2 lines back, and the machine keeps turning. A read receipt with no reply is the household equivalent of somebody putting the phone down on you mid-sentence. One of Anne's aides flagged the missing reply on Tuesday evening and was told, politely, that Mrs. Lopes' office had probably intended to reply in the morning. It did not reply in the morning. It has still not replied. And the courier bag came through the gate at 8:11 on Wednesday, carrying the exact material the letter had ordered destroyed. The officer on the scanner stopped the bag and rang his supervisor. The supervisor rang the household office. The household office rang the King's private secretary. And by 8:47, 3 separate people inside Windsor Castle were looking at a photograph of a cream card with gold edging, and the 3 words that were not supposed to exist on it were sitting there in raised print at the top of every single one, under the authority of Her Majesty. Somebody had printed 60 of them, and 60 is a number I want you to hold on to, because the guest list was 38. The extra 22 is one of the things that made Anne's face change when the numbers were laid out in front of her at 10 past 10. You do not print 22 spare place cards. You print 2, maybe 3, in case a name is misspelled or a glass of water goes over one during the setup. 22 spare cards means somebody expected the guest list to grow, and to grow after the palace had signed off on it. Somewhere between Monday afternoon and Wednesday morning, somebody had been quietly telling people the lunch was on, and telling them in a way that made them believe the invitation carried the weight of the crown. And every one of those cards, all 60 of them, said so in gold. Anne arrived at Windsor at 10:52. She did not go to the south wing. She went to the household office first, and she asked for 3 things in the order she always asks for them: the original instruction from the private secretary, the red receipt log from Laura Lopes' office, and the printer's docket for the cards. She got the first 2 inside 4 minutes. The third took nearly an hour, and when it came, it was worse than anybody in the room had expected. The cards had not been printed by the household's usual stationer. They had been ordered privately, paid for privately, and delivered to an address that was not Ray Mill House and not any of the properties officially connected to the Queen. The invoice had been settled in cash the previous Friday. 3 days before the King's private secretary's letter even went out. Read that again in your head, because that is the moment this stops being a mix-up and starts being something else. The cards were ordered before the instruction banning them existed, which means somebody, somewhere in the chain, already knew the instruction was coming and had decided to move first. You do not spend that kind of money on printed material at short notice unless somebody has told you the paperwork will catch up later. And the person who signs off the paperwork inside the King's household did not sign anything. Anne asked the obvious question. She wanted to know who had placed the order. The printer had a name on the docket. It belonged to a junior member of the Queen's household, a woman in her late 20s who had joined the office 18 months earlier and whose main job was correspondence and diary. She was not senior enough to spend that money without approval, and she was not senior enough to invoke the phrase under the authority of Her Majesty on printed material. But she had, and she had done it 3 days before anybody in the King's office had put anything in writing. Anne asked for her to be brought up. She was not in the building. She had signed out at 7:48 that morning, more than 20 minutes before the courier bag went through the scanner, and she had not signed back in. That is the moment Anne locked the south wing. She did not raise her voice. People who work around Anne will tell you that the quiet version is the one to watch for. She gave 3 instructions in about 40 seconds, no cards to leave the household office, no members of Mrs. Lopes's private staff to enter or leave the south wing, and nobody to telephone Ray Mill House. She wanted the day to sit still until she understood what was moving underneath it, and then she asked for the guest list. 38 names. She read them in the order they were typed. Old friends of Camilla's from before the marriage, 2 cousins on the Shand side, a novelist, a gardener whose name you would know if I said it, 3 trustees of a charitable foundation Laura Lopes has been involved with for years, and then 2 names at the bottom that stopped her reading. A man who runs a private office in Mayfair specializing in the movement of high-value collections between family trusts, and a woman who sits on the board of a foundation that has spent the last 6 years quietly building a cultural program parallel to the official royal one. The same kind of work Anne had circled in red pen during that other business a few months earlier. Different people this time. Same shape of operation. Anne did not need anybody to tell her what those 2 names on a guest list meant. She has spent her whole working life inside the language of that institution, and she has watched, more than once now, the same pattern build itself in the same corner of the same house. A private lunch, a printed card with royal wording on it, a photograph that finds its way into a diary column, and 18 months later a foundation with a crown on its letterhead and 40 patrons who believe they are doing something official. Kill it on day 1, and it costs you a morning. Kill it in year 2, and it costs you a decade. She asked for Laura Lopes to be brought to the household office. Laura arrived at 12:14, not from the south wing, but from a private sitting room upstairs, which was the first thing that told Anne the day was going to be longer than she had planned. Laura had been in the castle since 9:20. She had come through a family access point at the north end, and nobody on that gate had known there was a hold on her staff or on her material, because the hold had been placed 40 minutes after she walked in. She had spent the morning in the sitting room with 2 members of her mother's household, and one of them was the woman whose name was on the printer's docket. The woman who had signed out at 7:48 had come back in through a different gate at 9:35 and had not signed the second book. Anne asked Laura, in the flat voice, whether she had seen the letter from the king's private secretary. Laura said she had. Anne asked whether she had understood it. Laura said she had. Anne asked why the cards had been printed anyway, and Laura gave the answer that turned the morning. She said the cards had been printed before the letter arrived. She said she had assumed, when the letter came, that the material already produced was outside the scope of the instruction, because the instruction referred to future printing. Anne asked her to read paragraph 4 out loud. Laura read it. The paragraph did not refer to future printing. It referred to any material, already printed or not, and it ordered the destruction of anything that carried royal styling. Laura read it a second time without being asked, and then she said, quietly, that she had been advised the paragraph could be interpreted more narrowly. Advised by whom? Anne asked it once, and Laura did not answer. Anne asked it a second time, and Laura looked at the door. The woman who had signed the docket was 2 floors below, in an office she should not have been in, and Anne knew it before Laura's eyes finished moving. The interview with the junior aide happened at 1:20. She was frightened, and she had not brought a note-taker, and she made the choice that people in that position sometimes make when they realize the room is not going to shift for them. She told the truth. She said she had been asked, 3 weeks earlier, to help with the printed material for Mrs. Lopes's lunch. She had been told the material was to carry a particular form of wording because the event, although private in name, was to be understood as sitting under the Queen's patronage. She had queried the wording once in an email and had been told not to worry about the letter that would arrive from the King's office because the letter was procedural and the wording had been agreed separately in a private conversation. She had believed that. She had placed the order. She had paid the invoice out of an operational account she had authority to draw on for household stationery, and she had signed the docket in her own name because that was the honest way to do it. And when the letter had arrived on Monday afternoon and had said the exact opposite of what she had been told, she had gone to the person who had given her the earlier instruction and had asked what to do. She had been told to leave it. She had been told the King's letter would be dealt with, and she had left it. Anne asked her, in one sentence, who had given her the earlier instruction. The junior aide said a name. It was not Camilla's name. It was not Laura's name. It was the name of a senior member of the Queen's private office who had been in post for close to a decade, and who was, at that moment, in London, in a meeting Anne had not been told about, with a person whose name had appeared on the guest list at the bottom, the Mayfair man. The one who moves collections between family trusts. That is the point where Anne stopped treating this as a stationary incident. She asked for the household diary for the last 6 weeks, and she asked for it unredacted. She asked for the correspondence log of the Queen's private office, and she asked for the entries flagged as personal, and she asked for one telephone call to be placed from a secure line to the King's private secretary in London with a message of 3 words, "Come to Windsor." Camilla arrived before he did. She came through the same north gate Laura had used, and she came without notice, and she came with a senior member of her private office beside her, the one who had been in the London meeting an hour earlier. Anne met her in a first-floor room with the door closed, and 2 members of the household standing outside it, which is not how family conversations happen in that building. Camilla asked what her daughter was doing sitting in a sitting room like a schoolgirl waiting to be told off. Anne said that her daughter was sitting in a sitting room because the material for her lunch had been printed in defiance of a written instruction from the King, and because the person who had authorized the printing worked in Camilla's own office, and because the man who had been on the guest list at the bottom had spent the morning in a room in Mayfair with the person Anne was now looking at across the table. Camilla did not deny any of it. She did something more interesting. She said the phrase had been agreed. She said her husband had, in a private conversation weeks earlier, told her he was content for the lunch to be described as being held under the authority of Her Majesty, because the phrase was accurate, and because the lunch was a courtesy from the Queen to her personal circle, and because he did not see the harm in it. She said the letter from the private secretary had been written without her husband's knowledge, on the initiative of an office that had been trying, for the better part of a year, to draw a line around her family that was tighter than the one her marriage had drawn around it. And she said, in the same flat voice Anne had been using all morning, that if Anne wanted to have this conversation, she should have it with the king. Anne said she intended to, and she said it with the door still closed. The king arrived at 2:40. He came without a private secretary, which was the first thing Anne noticed, and he carried nothing under his arm, which was the second. He sat down at the end of the table and asked, in the voice of a man who has spent 40 years being asked to settle other people's arguments, what the trouble was. Anne slid the letter across the table, the one his private secretary had signed on Monday afternoon. She asked him whether he had authorized it. He read it slowly, and he took long enough over it that everybody in the room understood he was reading it for the first time. Then he said he had not seen the letter before it went out, but that it reflected a position his office had been developing for some time, and that the position was, in his view, correct. Camilla looked at him across the table, and she said one sentence. "You told me the phrase was agreed." The king did not answer immediately. He looked at the letter, and then he looked at the printed card that Anne had placed on the table beside it, and then he looked at his wife, and he said, very quietly, that he had told her the phrase was not a problem. He had not told her it was agreed. And a phrase that is not a problem, spoken in a private sitting room between a husband and a wife, is not an instruction to a household, and it is not authority to spend money on printed material, and it is not a license for a junior aide to sign a docket in her own name for a run of 60 cards that carry royal styling in gold ink. Camilla said nothing to that. Laura, who had been brought upstairs at 2:15 and had been sitting in the corner without a word since, closed her eyes. And the senior member of the Queen's office, the one who had been in London that morning, understood in that moment that the meeting she had taken in Mayfair was going to be the last piece of work she did in that building. The king asked to see the printer's docket. He read it. He asked to see the invoice. He read that. He asked for the guest list, and he read the names, and he stopped at the same 2 names Anne had stopped at 3 hours earlier, and he put his finger under the first of them, the Mayfair man, and he asked who had added the name. The senior aide said, without being asked twice, that she had. She said the man had been suggested to her by a mutual acquaintance as somebody who might be useful to the Queen's family in matters of private estate planning, and she had thought a lunch was a natural way to introduce him. The king asked her whether she had discussed the man with the Queen. She said she had not. He asked her whether she had discussed him with Mrs. Lopes. She said she had, in passing. He asked her whether she had discussed him with him. She said she had not. And he closed the guest list and pushed it toward the middle of the table, and he said one sentence that ended the afternoon. He said that no member of his wife's private office was to place any name on any guest list for any event held in a royal residence without written approval from his own private secretary, and that the approval was to be in writing, and that the writing was to be filed, and that the filing was to be available to the Princess Royal on request. He did not look at his wife when he said it. He looked at the aide, and the aide understood what was being said to her, and what was being said past her. Camilla stood up. She said, before she left the room, that her husband had spent a very long time letting other people draw the lines around her family, and that he had, this afternoon, drawn one himself, and that she hoped he would remember he had drawn it the next time somebody in his own office overreached in his name. Then she left. Laura followed her. The senior aide left through a different door with a member of the household walking behind her, and by 4 in the afternoon, her access pass had been withdrawn, and her office had been sealed, and the 60 cards had been placed in a box and taken to the household office and locked in a cupboard that Anne had the only key to. The king stayed in the room after everybody else had gone. Anne stayed with him. They did not speak for a long time, and then the king said, to nobody in particular, that he was tired of finding out about instructions written in his name from people who had not been asked to write them. Anne said that the answer to that was to say, out loud and in writing, where affection ended and authority began, and to say it in a way that did not require a Wednesday morning at Windsor to enforce it. The king did not answer her. He picked up the letter from his private secretary, folded it once, put it inside his jacket, and left the room. The story did not appear anywhere for 11 days. When it did, it appeared sideways. A diary column carried 3 lines about a private lunch at Windsor that had been quietly rescheduled. A Sunday paper carried a longer piece, unsourced, about tensions inside the Queen's private office and the departure of a senior aide who had been in post for close to a decade. Neither piece mentioned the cards. Neither piece mentioned the phrase. And the phrase, which is the whole reason any of this happened, has never appeared in print in the form it was printed on those cards, because Anne had every single one of them destroyed on the Thursday morning, personally, in the household office, with 2 witnesses present, and the ashes taken away in a bag she signed for herself. The lunch went ahead 6 weeks later, in a private house in Wiltshire, with 22 guests instead of 38. The Mayfair man was not on the list. Neither was the woman from the Parallel Foundation. The cards were plain white with black lettering, and they carried no styling of any kind. Laura Lopes signed each one herself in blue ink at the bottom. Her mother did not attend. The question I keep coming back to, and the one I want you to think about, is not whether the phrase should have been printed, because that answer is on the letter, and the letter is clear. The question is who told the junior aide, 3 weeks before the letter went out, that the phrase had been agreed, because somebody did, and that somebody has not been named in any of the paperwork I have been able to read, and the senior aide who took the fall in Mayfair had joined the office long after that first conversation is supposed to have taken place, which means there is a name in this story I have not written down yet, and the reason I have not written it down is that I do not have it yet. Tell me in the comments which one you think it is. The husband who let a private phrase sit around in a sitting room for weeks without saying it out loud in front of a secretary. The wife who took the phrase as agreement and built a lunch around it. The daughter who read a letter and believed she had been advised her way out of it. Or the aide in London who spent a morning in Mayfair with a man whose job is to move things quietly between families and never leave a docket. I have read the letter about 40 times now, and I still do not know which of the 4 of them thought the phrase was going to survive contact with the Princess Royal on a Wednesday morning. Next time, 3 weeks before any of this, a second letter went out from the King's private office to a different member of the family entirely. It has not been mentioned anywhere, and the person it was sent to has not been seen at a public engagement since.